Hello. It's time for a reflections video. It's been a while since we've done one of these. This session was the fourth session of four, again, and it, however, took 5 weeks to get those 4 sessions played. So I've been playing for a while. This episode, part D, was the completion of a 2-part episode, and which began in Court of Opinion, which at that time wasn't called Court of Opinion Part 1, but is now retroactively labeled on the collector's DVD kind of thing as Part 1. And this is Part 2, and maybe some special editions someday would have it, combined together or something laughable like that. All right. Reflections. Well, the thing that's really on my mind right now was how different Part D felt from A, B, and C. In parts A, B, and C, we began to play longer. Which is nice. We weren't like trying to get to 90 minutes. Instead, we were in and around the 2-hour mark. And in Part D, we played for 3 hours. So I feel like it's significant to mention the longer runtime has an influence in this game on how things feel. Like the ebb and flow of momentum is or has a greater effect. It's more noticeable rather than the pool kind of filling up or being drained and then the session coming to an end. We can see it having, increases and decreases from scene to scene. And I think that was an important thing to experience. Threat was pretty interesting over the run of the 4 sessions. It was slow to build, and it didn't really go up in peaks and valleys like get an amount, spend it down, get an amount, spend it down. It continued to climb, although I was spending it throughout for things like increasing the complication range, adding complications to scenes, and the like. In the final session, we had not a long or complicated combat, but we had conflict that lasted pretty much through the 3 hours. There was a staging area in the beginning of the session where we had more of a feeling of alliance, of 2 forces joining together to deal with a threat. But once they moved in to deal with the threat, then it was pretty much all conflict all the time, and moving back and forth between surety of purpose and certainty of action, and again that question of not really knowing what the enemy might do. Having the week off in between Part C and Part D had an impact on how I was approaching the session. It gave me longer to consider how I wanted to play it. And you'll be able to see that evolution of thought in the preparation video, which will also be released around the same time that this is. The question which I had to ultimately resolve was how intensely or how to what degree of challenge should I use the adversaries in this particular episode, right? Should I stick to the pattern laid down by the original series in the episode Where No Man Has Gone Before, where Kirk's friend Gary Mitchell is granted incredible abilities and then winds up becoming the enemy of the episode. Should I keep that vast cosmic power on a human level? Should I make time the enemy? They have certain steps that they need to complete before they can, fully ascend to these horrifying abilities that the space legends speak of. Or, should I just go into it and play it by ear, and see what it feels like? Like, for example, if the approach the players had taken was to try and negotiate, to try and do something around negotiation, whether that, that's spring a trap or create some kind of effect that neutralizes the energy frequency that they have spent so much time and resources assessing, right? Should they, create some kind of social conflict trap or social conflict resolution? How hard do I want to play? Like, how direct? How much force do I want to bring? Whether that's social force or physical force. If they opt for combat, again, what do I want to do? And the variety of things that I could do, especially with the very large amount of threat that I was sitting on, were quite staggering, but not terribly interesting from the point of view of a television episode, from a point of view of a television episode that does need to end at some point, and from the point of view of what the original series was about. The action and the interactions had purpose. So the theme that I was operating on was, in a sense, a mirror of Court of Opinion Part 1. Throughout, we've been looking at loyalty. And if you look at Court of Opinion Part 1, I think you can see what Starfleet expects in terms of loyalty and what people expect of Starfleet. We can see this demonstrated to some extent or another by the competency hearing, by the way that Ensign Yang's politically powerful parents behave, by the way that the cadets that Ensign Yang tangled with politically behave, by the nature of the crew of the Avicenna who have survived from its days as the Dauntless. We can see an awful lot of what loyalty demands. And, if we look at Ensign Yang, we see loyalty, filial piety, his loyalty to his brother, his loyalty to his parents and the legacy of his family, what he owes to Starfleet itself to be a good officer, what he owes to himself, his own vision of himself, and how he sees charting his course, as it were, in Starfleet. With Korsakov, we see him, I think, in a pretty real sense, torn by decisions of the past and trying to understand those decisions and justify them, and wanting to repair what seems like a damaged relationship with Mbuto and the damaged relationship with the original crew of the Avicenna. So there's a lot of themes that we can connect to the notion of loyalty, and from that position is how I played people. For example, we have a scene between Ensign Yang and the operations manager of Starbase 11. Now, KC, the player, draws upon a resource that he has, a reputation point, which he can use to curry favor. And he role played this by trying to connect on a social and political and Starfleet level with the operations manager, who is enlisted personnel. He played it straight. He walked in and said, "This is what I want to do, and I don't want to get involved in like tit for tat manipulations, and I don't want to abuse the system. I want to use the system. I want to outplay them," kind of thing. And that was a very cool approach, a surprising and refreshing approach, which I really enjoyed. He came in and wanted to be able to play the game well and fairly. So I like that. The operations officer I played from this perspective that I'm talking about, loyalty to Starfleet, but that ideal Starfleet, and loyalty to straight shooters and people who want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. And so with this theme in mind, we can understand how the NPCs are played, how the scene is set up, and what type of connections to real life I'm throwing out there for, as an opportunity to examine or experience or explore or whatever the players choose to do with these things. To lesser extents, or maybe to the same extent, we can see the relationship between Anya and Jane Finch. We can see the growing relationships between Joanne Parker and Yang, and Anya and Jane, and so loyalty is the underpinning of Court of Opinion 2. So, or 1. So Court of Opinion 2, the intent is to turn loyalty upon itself and take a look at betrayal. Not necessarily intentional betrayal, but the idea of the feeling of having been betrayed, and of having betrayed, and of being perceived as having betrayed. Thought this was very fertile ground to explore if we could. If the format of play, if the length of play, if the situations that our interactions as players brought about would allow it. At a certain point in time, I find that groups learn to interpret different signals from each other, and some of this stuff, like a thematic underpinning to play, becomes easier to spot, or the behaviors or the actions of your fellow players begins to be something that you can not predict per se, but you are comfortable knowing what side of a question they might come down on, either as people or as the character that they're playing. That kind of thing, you grow to know them. So this particular episode, Court of Opinion Part 2, in that regard, I don't think that we are there yet. And so we have a new captain. And we have a new captain who I'm trying to portray as dynamic, as sharp, as not showing up particularly for some vendetta, but showing up with a job to do, but has shown up to do that job well. So in every regard, someone who embodies the kind of traits that we have seen from our main characters. So this is a character that they might find themselves liking. But what about Tillich? What about their memories of Captain Anders? They were given confusing orders, vague orders, orders that could allow Starfleet to save face, plausible deniability, and all that. So, what about that ideal Starfleet? Yang's brother is in desperate peril. How can we how can we rescue any of the crew? How can we rescue specific members of the crew? Is it possible to free them from the condition that they are in? Is it possible to use violence to bring the ship to heal enough to be able to, raid it, board it, and find some kind of otherwise peaceful solution? Which crew members can we put at risk in order to save some or all of the Potemkin's crew? These are the questions which the episode is trying to put forward and to enable for, rich science fiction, Star Trek type play, to enable players to be able to interact with and use. We will have to see from their reflections and any further commentary that comes from this episode. We'll have to see if any of that was important or noticed, or if it was something that was lost along the way, or if there were no real opportunities granted by how I structured things for them to feel like they could interact with whatever themes or notions or characterizations that were put forward. There's two sides to everything. So the action of the different sessions was at times, for me, quite compelling. Although maybe not in the traditional TV sense. Not all of these episodes are going to have the amount of material that might neatly fit into a 1-hour dramatic television series, or be handled with the amount of detail that they might be given in a television show. So with the short runtime with the extended yet still short runtime of these sessions, we zoomed in a lot on things that maybe in a real television show might be glossed over. We zoomed in on things which maybe if we were 5 or 6 or 10 more episodes into a campaign, we might have glossed over or handled with a different kind of efficiency. At the same time, we learned a lot about the crew. We learned a lot about what their reactions are to the situation and what their primary concern is. And it was, I think, very rewarding that their primary concern was to try to rescue the crew of the Potemkin, right? Not to end the threat to the galaxy, but to end the threat to their fellow Starfleet officers. And I find, regardless of whatever else did or did not register on the players, that was a serious concern. I found very gratifying, rewarding, and I really wanted to see if they could do it. And in session D, that not exactly slow build, but let's say an uneven build, through information gathering, through strategizing, through bringing all their skills to bear in trying to outrace Anders to the dark heart. All of these things, we arrive in session D, and very quickly the players reach the conclusion that they're going to have to use physical violence. They can't risk getting into social contact with these beings who may or may not be able to subvert their sense of reality. They can't risk it. So they have to try and disable the ship, and then once the ship is disabled, they need to get in and try and corral the crew and get them under control. No easy task. But they had the Gorn on their side. Spoilers! And the Gorn were packing a pretty devastating but slow punch, which I modeled on, my past and current love affair with Starfleet battles and the Gorn themselves from the original series, a slow, powerful weapon. I had a lot of tricks up my sleeve for how the Gorn could get involved, but I also wanted them to, in their NPC status, not wanting them to be running the show. Right. So there are several efforts that I made to put them into a support role for the Avicenna for those reasons. It's not the show up and watch the Gorn do things time, right? It's a role-playing game, and the players need to be playing their roles. We need to be looking at them. So for those considerations, the dice really had a lot to say on how things went. It was pretty tense and pretty enjoyable how much damage could be done and to what, and how much momentum and threat was available to enhance or change those results. And so the combat was as devastating as the series has led us to expect, and fit very well with my conception of how episodic combat translates into the role-playing game. There were no really surprise results, but there were results that were, satisfying, or, oh, I can't believe that this roll was so low, or I can't believe that this roll was so high, or we have all of this momentum available, which allows us to do this devastating thing. And so in terms of the fiction that was produced by the conflict, it was pretty thrilling and compelling. How we got to that fiction, nothing has changed. It still turned into a negotiation. Every single point expenditure had to be discussed. All the options had to be discussed. And then by committee, they decided what a single character was going to do. So that took a lot of the satisfaction out of things for me. So that was disappointing. But all the way through to the end of the episode, we have opportunities for the dice not to just say succeed or fail, but for the dice to come in and say, scrape by or die. It was pretty dire. It really felt like a conclusion. And there were several opportunities where one or the other main character, could just, be gone with no real possibility for rescue. There was one scene where I made a decision based on expedience, which I normally wouldn't do, but we were already over time, and I know that's very difficult for Ron, because he's playing at the start of his day, and he has a window in which to operate, and we had far exceeded the agreed upon window. So there was a decision made about, can a phaser be drawn or not, and I went with what was more interesting from, what would we like to see be possible in the scene, rather than, what do the rules say can be done, or, what is actually existing in the fiction. But we, after, a few minutes of, not few minutes, but after another couple of moments of description, reevaluated that entire scene, and then were able to step away from that decision. So that was nice. It's not that discussion has no particular value. But there are effective and efficient ways to play that include all the things that we're interested in, and there are ways that really drag things down and make them slow and turn them into uh, play by committee. Well, positives. An awful lot was accomplished, and the episode ends with failure. The Potemkin is lost. We don't know who was lost or how many crew were lost. We don't know how many were freed. We do know that um, Captain Anders was freed of his possession, which implies that the rest of the crew were as well. And if the Potemkin is lost, then a significant portion of the crew is lost, and lost as themselves, not as the horrifying enemies I tried to describe them as. So that's pretty bleak. It's a pretty bleak ending. But we still have experience and reputation to go through. And that will, because that is also rolled, that will have a say on ultimately how things turned out. Right? So the dice may show that the crew of the Avicenna were able to bring about a pretty acceptable rescue, all things considered. Or it may show them, reprimanded and in disgrace. And that is another thing that's entirely in the hands of the dice. So that's kind of interesting. And it would be nice if that was a part of this episode, but understandably it couldn't have been, and we haven't been doing it that way. So we'll need to get together to handle that, to do experience for the crew from this episode, and to handle their reputation. As my final reflection for this episode, I have come to the conclusion that as far as running the campaign, First Response, although it has had some real highlights and a lot of fun, it has also had its frustrations. And the amount of work that I've set up for myself, for at nobody's request, just the workload that I've put on myself to do uh, the editing of the actual play videos the way they are, and uh, the relative utility which the content of the episodes provides in the let's learn how to play Star Trek Adventures. I don't know that those things match up. So what I would like to do is what I normally like to do at a certain point in the introducing a game to fellow gamers that I enjoy gaming with. I pass the game on to them. Okay, now it's your turn. And so that's where we sit. I'm hoping that one or both of the gentlemen, Casey and Ron, will want to run the game, whether they want to continue First Response with them in the Game Master seat and me as a player, or whether they want to start their own campaigns with the other two of us and maybe some other people if they can be recruited as players. That's all cool. But I've reached the part where I say, okay, now let's continue the learning process with you running the game, with you in the non-threatening, non-difficult, very enjoyable role of Game Master. In order to play a game well, I think we need to be open to playing all the roles, right? Whether we, as a player, have decided we're going to play a character who's more of a supporting character, than a leading character, or whether we're going to, you know, be the player who doesn't actually have a character of their own. Instead, they are the universe. So that's where we are. So I'm pretty happy to have gotten this far and have 4 complete, relatively coherent episodes with deep and interesting characters that have a lot of life in them yet. And I have learned to love this little ship, which didn't really grab my interest at the beginning. It's not a design, not a design I like, and not a mission role that I would have chosen myself. But I found a lot of joy in creating the missions that the crew of the USS Avicenna had to deal with, and I look at the Saladin class, or the Alaric variant of the Saladin, with entirely new eyes now. It's a far more interesting ship than I gave it credit for because of its aesthetics, and I'll even now consider running it in Starfleet battles in the future, because I've had so much fun seeing what they can do with it, and how much threat and versatility it can actually bring to bear, and how it can turn that legacy of violence into a mission of mercy. And that is the strongest theme that I'm taking away personally from Star Trek Adventures First Response. It's the kind of thing I look for in Star Trek, period, and in Star Trek Adventures as a role player. So, thanks for watching all of these actual play videos and the attendant videos, if you have, and for being part of this journey. Maybe the campaign will continue. At the time of recording, cannot say. But maybe Star Trek Adventures just itself will continue. Or maybe this is the end of Star Trek Adventures on the channel for a while. But anyway, until the next game, the next video, take care.